Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizenhausen. It's December 7th today, and there are a lot of important news stories. So in this episode, the US adopts a new national security strategy. Europe is in shock. The strategy buries NATO expansion and essentially leaves Europe one-on-one with Russia. And Trump is changing the course the US has followed for the past 80 years. The details of this crucial document and what surprises it holds. There are some hidden for Ukraine. London is the first to cross the Rubicon and is preparing to confiscate Russian assets worth $10 billion. Not just to confiscate them, but to transfer them to a fund from which Ukraine can purchase missiles to strike Russia. We expect a hysterical reaction of cosmic proportions in the Kremlin. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drones are leaving Russia's nuclear triad without fuel. The Hague versus Trump. There will be no amnesty for Putin. The arrest warrant will remain in force forever. And the Kremlin is switching to a monstrous scorched earth tactic, a new strategy for striking Ukraine. And in Russia, they've come up with a way to completely replace Western technologies. You're going to laugh for a long time when you hear what they've come up with. All this and more in today's episode. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So, the US has published a new national security strategy, which has finally put an end to the old world order that lasted for more than 80 years after World War II. This is exactly the news I want to start the episode with, because in essence what has happened is a fundamental change in the world order and the balance of power on the planet. For 80 years, the Western world was based on the axiom that the security of Europe equaled the security of the United States. Trump, with a red marker, crossed all of that out. In other words, the US included in its national security strategy a rejection of NATO expansion and the restoration of relations with Russia. How nice! Two of Putin's demands have been included in the US national security strategy at once. And the Donald Trump administration is ready to abandon the main principles that have been in place since World War II. That's what follows from this document. In other words, these principles generally provided for US military security guarantees, and those who wanted to receive them would join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The fundamental interest of the United States is to reach an agreement on the swift cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, with the aim of stabilizing the European economy, preventing unintended escalation or expansion of the war, and restoring strategic stability in relations with Russia, according to the strategy. But all of this has already happened before, one wants to say. Remember how Barack Obama wanted to reset relations with Russia? He was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in advance for that. Maybe Donald Trump thinks that if he repeats these steps, tries to reset relations, he'll get one too. A Nobel Prize? Or what? What's the logic here? Oh, right, I forgot to mention that after Obama tried to reset relations with the Russian Federation, it led to the exact opposite result. The bald Kremlin maniac considered the US weak at that time and became even more brazen. Back then, Obama's indecisiveness regarding strikes against Assad's regime effectively gave Putin free rein, and he annexed Crimea and occupied Donbas. Well, that's just a small remark about how all this ends. Let's move on. The document also emphasizes that the Trump administration cannot agree with European officials who, attention, have unrealistic expectations regarding the war in Ukraine. And what are these expectations? That Ukraine can resist, or that Ukraine, given the necessary amount of weaponry, can deal a harsh beating to the Russians? As it happened before? This has already happened. When Ukraine received the necessary weapons, they were chased off with all sorts of rags. That's why Washington intends to shift the responsibility for its own defense onto Europe, stabilize relations with Russia, and abandon further NATO expansion. Listen, what exactly do you call it when, having all the very best cards in your hand, you just foolishly throw them all away? What do you call that? Donald Trump, that's his kind of language. Like this, good cards, good hand, and so on. You have the best cards in your hand. Why are you throwing them away? Explain it to me. One of the priorities of the Trump administration's European policy is set out in the strategy as follows: to put an end to the perception of NATO as an ever-expanding alliance and to prevent such a development in reality. Also, according to this document, the goal of the US is to reduce military support for its European allies. Europe must stand on its own feet and take primary responsibility for its own defense, the strategy says. Agreed. Here, Trump did well. He made everyone pay more for their own defense. Because on the one hand, if Russia is no longer a threat, then why should Europe have to pay more for its own defense? The logic is this: we understand that Russia is a threat, but then why are you excluding them from these existential threats? So, to put it simply, NATO is no longer expanding. Those who managed to join NATO, good for them. Those who didn't make it, well, your train has left the station. And the signal to Putin is everyone who's in NATO, don't touch them. Well, like how Finland and Sweden, for example, were lucky enough to literally jump onto the last car. But as for everyone else who didn't make it, they now become potential victims of the mothballed Kremlin ghoul. Is that it? This is, well, simply probably the most important document of this year. I mean, before, Trump just had some tweets, some, fragmented phrases. But now all of that is in a document. It has become the official US doctrine, and there are also additional key points in it. In addition to rejecting NATO expansion and pivoting toward Russia, the strategy contains 3 more important points that also change the worldview. So now for the US, China is threat number 1. And the only thing is, Russia is not a threat. Russia is not considered an existential threat. Well, now look at the logic. In other words, the point of restoring relations with Moscow is not because Trump likes hugging Putin on red carpets, but in order to pull Russia away from China. That's the logic. In other words, this is an attempt to repeat Henry Kissinger's trick from the 70s, only in reverse. Back then, they tried to befriend China in order to pull China away from the USSR. Well, and in the end, who pulled whom away? And one more important point, energy dominance as a weapon. In other words, oil and gas are declared strategic assets of freedom, and the US officially rejects all these climate agreements if they suddenly contradict the economy. So the strategy states, America will sell energy to its allies so that they don't depend on autocracies. Hello, Orban, so what about him then? But at the same time, the allies themselves are required to buy American, not cheap autocratic products. That means no Chinese solar panels, no Russian gas. Buy American and then everything will be fine. But in that case, the US doesn't guarantee you protection, even within the framework of the North Atlantic Alliance. So what are the perks here? For the first time, they've included the internal border with Mexico. That is, the cartels have been equated with terrorist organizations, and naturally this is a green light. It gives the Pentagon a free hand to conduct operations up to and including drone strikes, for example, on Mexican territory without Mexico's consent. And here's an important point. Pay up or defend yourself. Basically, that's how it works. It is mentioned that the target defense spending for allies should no longer be 2% as it was before. Many didn't reach that before, but now it's 3 to 4% of GDP. Even for those who pay officially without guarantees of a nuclear umbrella, the question remains, even for those who do pay. Well, it all makes sense here. If you're afraid of Russia, spend more on defense. If you're wary of Russia, well, maybe not afraid, but cautious. If you consider the Botox jellyfish to be irrational, then pay more and spend on defense. That's all correct here. Well, of course, you know why Europe is in shock, because Brussels, in fact, and the European Union as a whole are considered economic competitors, not just political partners. In other words, Trump sees a competitor here, a bureaucratic monster that is strangling American business. Well, there's some logic to that. That is, there's unfair trade going on, and Trump is proposing to fix all of this. And another important point, now about the nuclear umbrella, pay more, will protect you, and so on. The strategy suggests rethinking Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the one that says all for one. Trump proposes to interpret it not as an automatic entry into war by the entire alliance, but as an obligation to consider providing assistance. So, in fact, NATO turns from a military alliance into, I don't know, some kind of discussion club. That is, if someone is attacked, now we'll get together and debate whether to provide assistance, who will provide it, and in what amount. So you see, that's Article 5, and then you might as well, I don't know, put it in the same place as the Budapest Memorandum. Those kinds of guarantees. And in this context, Ukraine's guarantees look even more illusory. Then, they're offering us something like Article 5. So it will be Article 5, but a new Article 5. We'll get together somewhere, make some decisions, sit down, think it over, take our time, and so on. When Russia attacks Ukraine for the second time, well, for Europe, this is definitely a cold shower. Europe has been officially abandoned. That's it. I don't know. It's like a certificate of divorce. So, what is needed now? Germany, Poland, and France. They will be forced, and urgently so, literally within a year or two, to create a unified European Union army, a nuclear umbrella, because only France, here in Europe, is a nuclear state. Well, there's also the United Kingdom, but it left the European Union. In other words, either they create it, or someone will go negotiate with Putin, and that would mean a split in the West. Some will say, leave us alone, while others will push to create an army. For Ukraine, it's clear that this would mean being forced into peace, and it sends a signal to everyone. That's it, NATO is closed, no more. No one else will be admitted there. That's why, of course, the question that seems obvious to me and to our European partners is this. If you can just break it over your knee, the backbone of Putin's economy, then why are you making such concessions to him? And I emphasize, at the expense of your own NATO allies. Well, in general, the demands, there's another important point here. That is, the demands in this doctrine also include restoring stability. In other words, Putin is told, you go no further, you don't attack anyone else. But we all understand that after the disgraceful war in Ukraine, Putin will be in desperate need of yet another war. And the attempt to pull Russia away from China is also rather laughable. It seems like you'd have to completely misunderstand the basics to think otherwise. Some kind of interaction between these two states, how autocratic regimes have joined together in one club, no matter how long each has been in power. In other words, Trump is forgetting one very important thing. Dictators can rule for decades. Putin, for example, has already been in power for a quarter of a century. Xi Jinping definitely believes he will rule for the rest of his life. The Kim dynasty in North Korea, father, grandfather, father, and son, have ruled for 77 years. Well, it's almost 80 years now. Can you even imagine, where is Trump compared to 80 years of a dynasty's rule? After Trump, someone else will come and change the strategy again. Putin and Xi Jinping will be thinking about how to live for 150 years. They talk about things like that. The US will never in its lifetime pull Russia away from China while Putin is in power. Never in a lifetime. You'd have to be a naive fool or just a saboteur to think that way and bet on it. And here's the main takeaway. The US is retreating into its own fortress, building walls, pumping oil, and preparing for a showdown with China. That's it. Everyone else is on their own. Pay more and maybe we'll protect you. Well, maybe, but even that's not guaranteed. And Europe and Ukraine are left one-on-one with Russia. Those who survive will be the strong ones, either on their own or in an alliance, but definitely not those who are counting on a call to Washington in a critical moment. The era of American guarantees ended on December 7th, 2025. That's important. But it's important to understand that with the right approach, it's possible to create such an iron ring around the Russian Federation, around Putin, that he simply won't be able to breathe. Regarding the claims made by the Botoxed pensioner that he could go to war with Europe at any moment, here are a few numbers for you. By the way, Europe doesn't need to panic. You have the most powerful armed forces. I took a look, and you have 25 Patriot batteries alone, thousands of aircraft. In fact, if you count the Soviet and post-Soviet fleets, you could have up to 4,000, and on top of that, a huge number of other air defense systems. The European Union, and if we include the United Kingdom here, if we add that, that's several aircraft carriers, 30 submarines, almost 70 frigates and destroyers. So if you wanted to launch cruise missiles, that's several hundred cruise missiles in a single salvo. Can you imagine that? You really are powerful? So what's going on? When Russia attacked us, Ukraine didn't even have 100th of that. So everything will be fine. Just unite with Ukraine. And what can Russia counter with? I've said it 100 times already. Let's say several aircraft carriers from the EU and the UK. What does Russia have? One aircraft carrying cruiser, the Admiral Kuznetsov, which, let me remind you, is going to be scrapped for metal. What, are you afraid of them? Yes, it's a nuclear state, yes, but Putin will never use nuclear weapons. He's absolutely terrified for himself. The more you fear, the more that bald toad swells up, so to speak. The main takeaway is that NATO is dying in the form in which it was created. That's it. In its place, a new alliance needs to be created, which must definitely include 2 nuclear states. Well, that's the ideal scenario. France and the United Kingdom. The new alliance should not include Orban, Fico, or any other enthusiasts of kissing Putin's aging rubber jewelry box. Let me emphasize right away. I say Orban and Fico, not Hungary and Slovakia. I do not equate Orban's opinion with that of the Hungarians, nor Fico's with that of the Slovaks, respectively. And yes, the European Union is actually much stronger than even it thinks of itself. Perhaps it's time to start believing in itself. And let me remind you, be sure to include Ukraine in this union, or rather build it around Ukraine. Ukraine has tremendous experience in confronting the Russian Federation. Friends, let me remind you that right now, it is the valiant Ukrainian military holding back this army of ghouls. And yesterday was the Day of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Once again, congratulations to everyone involved, and I wish for everyone to return home alive to their loved ones. And our fundraising continues for the repair of military equipment for the legendary Freedom of Russia Legion, which is fighting for Ukraine. And the Legionnaires and Caesar have recorded a message for the viewers of this channel. Please listen to it.
Честь имею. Мы, бойцы Легиона Свобода России, обращаемся к зрителям канала Бориса Тизенгаузена. На фронте машина – это жизнь. Это наш шанс добраться до своих, подвести боеприпасы и эвакуировать раненых. Но каждый день мы теряем машину из-за дронов, обстрелов и мин. Сейчас нам нужны средства, чтобы наши колеса снова крутились. Каждый донат – это шанс выжить и бороться дальше. За свободу, за правду.
The Legion, in addition to carrying out missions on one of the hottest fronts, the Pokrovsky direction also conducts operations deep behind enemy lines. Among other things, they disrupt logistics and derail Russian trains carrying military equipment. In general, they carry out other painful operations for the Russians as well. So, friends, let's support the Legionnaires. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There you'll find Monobank, Private Bank and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And if for some reason you don't see the payment details here, there's always a QR code you can use as well. And to each of you, I always say a huge thank you personally for supporting Ukraine and our defenders. Your contribution is hard to overestimate. You are truly a great force. So let's help our warriors. And as always, after talking about good, bright people, now let's talk about the vile ones. About Orban, the European vulture of peace. European leaders have decided to be ready for war with Russia by 2030 and have made the decision to move to the final stage of preparation, Orban said at an anti-war rally in Kecskemét. His words were quoted by one of the publications. By the way, Orban is already sending a huge delegation to Moscow to negotiate cooperation after the sanctions are lifted. I'm telling you, he's a vulture, that's what he is, a vulture. According to Orban, there are 4 stages of conflict escalation. In his opinion, Europe is currently at the 3rd stage, with the introduction of universal conscription and the transition to a wartime economy. And the next phase is the phase of confrontation. So Orban, while being in the European Union, while being in NATO, is just blabbering from the podium that Europe, in its right mind, is planning to attack the Russian Federation. According to Orban, this is confirmed by the fact that Europe is now building a wartime economy. Actually, he put it differently. He said they are building a wartime economy. Notice how he separates himself from Europe. I quote, European leaders have decided that Europe is going to war. A decision on this issue has already been made. They are redirecting vehicle production to weapons manufacturing, Orban told the demonstrators. Both Orban and Putin always forget one thing. To say, well, what was the reason that Europe suddenly started preparing for war and arming itself? What was that event? Was it when the balding muskrat banged his fist on the table and declared, I am announcing a special military operation? What was that event, Orban? Can you tell us? Europe was just living its life, not worrying about anything, spending only about 2% on defense. So, the logic is very simple. Europe also wants to become a fortress. Well, Trump waved at us, but we're no fools either, so... But you know, inside the fortress, when I imagine this fortress, this citadel with its walls, inside the fortress, there shouldn't be that rat who will open the gates to the enemy from within. That's why some people need to be kicked right out of the European Union and NATO with a steel knight's boot. Let them crawl to their Kremlin suzerain, to the customs union, to the CSTO. And then they'll be saying, look at them, let's see how quickly Orban becomes the governor of the Hungarian Republic. And by the way, he'll be thrown out of there very quickly too. But you know what my team and I were thinking? Maybe we should actually launch a channel with Hungarian translation. Specifically for Hungary, because people in Hungary often write to me saying that Orban, just like Putin in his own country, has taken control of most of the media there. He won't shut down YouTube, I hope, or else he'll have to answer to Donald Trump. Well, anyway, we'll think about it. I think we'll end up doing it. So watch out, Adolf Putin and Benito Orban. By the way, since I mentioned the channel, something happened just the other day. One interesting event finally reached me. The silver play button from YouTube. This is precisely what it looks like when it arrives. A substantial, carefully packaged box. Just like this one you see before you, and nestled securely inside, there is an official personalized letter sent directly from the esteemed YouTube headquarters. And here, in all its gleaming glory, is the highly anticipated and much-deserved silver play button itself, presented beautifully, just like this, a true testament to our collective achievement. Well, I am satisfied, but look, here's an interesting point. The silver play button is awarded for reaching 100,000 subscribers on the channel. Right now, on the main channel, we already have almost 470,000 subscribers. The button took a long year and a half to arrive after we hit 100,000 because until recently, these buttons were not being shipped to Ukraine due to the war. Just recently, a manager contacted me and informed me that I could now receive the button. It literally arrived in Kiev just a couple of weeks ago. This was probably the longest wait ever, but I'm very happy, and I want to thank all of you, my friends. I remember the days when there were only 100,000 of us, and now we're quickly approaching 500,000. By the way, on the English language channel, we already have over 17,000 subscribers. And taking this opportunity, as always, I want to remind you to subscribe to this channel. Don't forget. We are fighting against Russian propaganda here, and it's really quite a battle. They come running here from time to time. Some herds of Russian bots, but that's actually a good thing. They create activity in the comments. Plus, we also expose the lies of all these pro-Putin ghouls, so subscribe and let's see how many of us there are. By the way, there is actually an upside to Trump breaking the traditional world order. It's better that it happened now, rather than in a situation where Russia attacked one of the countries. And it turned out that no one wanted to stand up for them. Donald Trump doesn't pick up the phone. Hello? I'm in a meeting, right? There's also another result of these actions of Trump saying, well, you're on your own now. And that's when Britain steps in. Britain, specifically. They decided, yeah, to hell with it, relying on someone else. Let's move forward ourselves. Britain prepared to transfer to Ukraine more than 10 billion in frozen Russian assets that they are holding. We're talking about transferring £8 billion, which is more than $10 billion. Previously, the West had only agreed to transfer the income, just the interest, from the frozen assets. But now they're ready to transfer the principal of the assets as well. And this is simply a breakthrough. Britain is the first of the G7 countries to pass a law that allows for the full confiscation of the sovereign assets of the aggressor in favor of the affected party. Attention! Without a decision from international courts, just by a decision of parliament. And good for them. By the way, these are the funds of the Central Bank of Russia. And interestingly, some accounts of frozen Russian state banks that were held in the city of London and have been blocked since 2022. An absolutely correct decision. And they didn't forget about themselves either. So how is this going to work? A defense and recovery fund is being created. And 50% of this money will go directly to purchases from British manufacturers. Storm Shadow missiles, new naval drones. 50% will go toward restoring the energy sector, which Russia is currently trying to destroy. Well done, the British. And here are some interesting facts. So this will have the effect of an icebreaker. Someone has to be the first. That's always how it is in Europe. Like, come on, you send the first tanks. Come on, you send the missiles, and then we'll follow you. So this is the icebreaker effect. Let me remind you, 200 billion are stashed away in Europe. And everyone there is still afraid, very afraid, that Russia will punish them somehow. But now look, the British will say, we did it and look what happened. What? Did Medvedev break off his chain in his kennel and come running to punish someone? No, everything's fine. And it's symbolic that this was done against the backdrop of announcing this new strategy. Well, if that's the case, now we decide for ourselves what to do with Russian assets. Moscow might, of course, strike back, but for the West, that's no longer frightening. So after this, the bridges will be burned. I really hope that the Western companies, which, by the way, Putin's representative Dmitriev recently mentioned, 150 American companies alone that haven't left Russia, will just run away. Now, out of fear that their assets will be seized to offset the frozen British ones, they'll flee. They shouldn't have stayed in Russia and kept doing business there. I'm not talking about those whose money got stuck and who left, but about those who continue to operate. Maybe at least this way they'll stop sponsoring this war. And there's another upside. In fact, the British are taking a very risky step for themselves. That is London. Everyone traditionally moved their capital there, and Russian oligarchs were especially fond of it too, London. Now, for example, the Saudis might start moving their capital out, or China. Well, the law has been passed, now they can confiscate it. So London is taking a colossal risk to its financial system for the sake of Ukraine. We appreciate that. And some cowards from Belgium are setting an example for us. And as always, to everyone who helps Ukraine, I say a huge thank you. Thank you to all the countries, all the governments, all the citizens. Huge, huge thanks in this very difficult time for Ukraine. We truly appreciate it. Now, regarding direct sanctions. Ukrainian drones have struck Rosneft's largest oil refinery for the 9th time since the beginning of the year. Well, they hit Ryazan, so that's the 9th time. I've already talked about this axiom for probably 3 episodes in a row. If Ukrainian drones didn't finish the job, they'll come back and finish it off. Remember this once and for all. Don't even try to fix it. Just don't even try. They'll come back and finish it off. And it turns out this plant also supplies Moscow.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
It processes 13 million tons, and it provides 5% of the total capacity of all of Russia. That is 5% of all oil refining in Russia. Do you see how things can turn out? And on top of that, they attacked, this was just epic, last night they attacked the oil depot in Engels. This isn't just some ordinary oil depot, it's a special fuel and lubricants base that's integrated into the logistics of the Engels 2 military airfield, where part of the Russian Federation's nuclear triad is stationed. And just so you understand, that's a pretty significant fact as well. A strike against the nuclear triad. A big hello to Putin and his updated nuclear doctrine. So when Russia launches its strategic aviation, for example, a single Tu-160, when fully fueled, takes on 148 tons of fuel. That's the minimum. On average, it takes about 200,000 liters. Just think about that for a moment. So it takes 200,000 liters. And if you consider, it's not just some regular gasoline from a gas station, it's high-quality aviation kerosene. And that's why this is a very serious blow. Engels is located 700 kilometers from Ukraine. Right now, 3 storage tanks are burning there. All in all, this is a very precise and effective strike. And you know what else? The regional governor let something slip, as usual. He says that everything was shot down. As always, this time they were shooting things down right over this unique oil depot. 42 Ukrainian drones arrived, he said. Just imagine, they flew 700 kilometers, 42 Ukrainian drones over the Saratov region. But how did they get past the air defense system? The governor let it slip. So, by that logic, they'll come back and finish the job. You might as well not bother fixing anything there or even trying to put out the fire. And here's some bad news for Putin. The International Criminal Court has refused to annul the arrest warrant for Putin, even if Trump declares an amnesty. Well, of course, Trump isn't a god either. That's something Putin can do in his own country. Maniacs, some serial killers, pardoned, that's it, go fight against Ukraine. But the warrant will remain in effect for the rest of his life. Of course, the Security Council still has to make a separate decision, and so on. Well, what can you do? What can you do? For Putin, this was already important, you see? None of these things will be lifted for him. Some of the oil sanctions might be lifted, but that's not the main thing. But to whitewash him as a terrorist, as a kidnapper of Ukrainian children, that's the real issue. And let me remind you, the warrant was issued to him. I'll repeat this in every program. It was issued because he abducted 20,000 Ukrainian children. So this is the most vile charge possible, and that's what he was charged with. Is there even an answer to this question? I want to ask a question right now. I know that people watch me from many countries, from a lot of countries, actually. YouTube has statistics. It's basically the whole world. Does anyone have an answer to this question? Maybe why is that? One terrorist who killed 3,000 people on September 11th is hunted down by the whole world and destroyed, while another terrorist who has killed hundreds of thousands of people, who bombs nursing homes and shopping centers every day, hospitals, train stations, they want to free him from responsibility. Do you have an answer to this question, people? Write in the comments. Well, in the meantime, Putin apparently finally believed that Trump would help lift all sanctions. He could receive a full amnesty, so he decided that now he could do absolutely anything. Amnesty is ahead. What can we do now? And Russia is changing its tactics in attacks on Ukraine. Now I'll tell you what they do. It's just so... Alright, let's go. They've changed, shifted their priorities for bombing. Now it's not just energy facilities, they've gone all in. They're using a scorched earth tactic, now striking critical civilian hubs. For example, they bombed the railway hub in Fastiv, destroyed the Nova Poshta terminal in Dnipro. This is an attempt to paralyze the delivery of any goods at all, from parcels to food, across the entire country. But the most monstrous step toward outright terrorism has been the deliberate attacks on medical logistics. Since November, Russia has systematically targeted central warehouses with medical supplies, leaving more than 600 hospitals without vital medications. Several strikes have been carried out on central warehouses with medical supplies. This is simply a new level of war crime. In other words, Putin is trying to kill Ukrainians, not only with cold, but also by depriving them of medicine. This is something for Donald Trump to take note of. If, back in the day, those responsible for the September 11th attack had not been eliminated, it would have happened again on an even bloodier scale. A terrorist only stops where he has stopped once and for all. And finally, the State Duma has decided how they will create their own iPhones and their own cars. In fact, everything will be their own. They'll replace all imports. That is, the State Duma of the Russian Federation stated that restricting the operation of foreign services in Russia will trigger a boom in domestic digital solutions. So look, they will ban foreign services and immediately alternatives will be developed in Russia. That's the engine of progress right there. In other words, they've discovered a new, unique law of economics. To learn to run faster than everyone else, you need to break the legs of all your competitors. That's their logic. Well, the genius of this idea is, of course, highly questionable. So maybe then you should ban Mercedes, BMW, and Audi in Russia. And then the Moskvich factory, out of fear, will start producing S-class competitors, right? Not just another Chinese crossover where you simply stick a Moskvich badge on it. So, by that same logic, by the way, if you take away all the iPhones from Russians, then Russian inventors using birch bark, roots, and staples could create a new, even more unique and powerful iPhone. But what the... Well, that's not how it works, obviously. So when you remove the competitors, you don't get quality, you end up with mediocrity, which you'll have to use anyway because there's no alternative. By the way, it's like I just described Putin, right? When you remove the competitors, you'll be stuck with mediocrity because there's no alternative, no one else to rule. And one more purely Russian news item. I think this special envoy of Putin, Dmitriev, who, by the way, is unfortunately not stupid at all, quite the opposite. But he just posted a very interesting message on the social network X. So why did I pay attention to this? The thing is, the social network X has been banned in Russia since 2022. And Dmitriev wrote a post in which he accuses the European Union of lacking freedom of speech using the social network X. But since this social network X is banned in Russia, he accessed it through a VPN. Citizens who keep a close watch determined that he used an IP address in France. So, he writes a post accusing the European Union of lacking freedom of speech while bypassing the Russian ban on this social network. Because it's blocked there. This is a purely Russian news story, just purely so. Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, subscribe to this channel, and I really ask you, let's help our soldiers. It's very difficult right now. They need transport right now. And it's extremely necessary. I know, together we are a great force. We can do this. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. And there are no small donations. Remember, our help for our defenders is needed now more than ever. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.